Imagine for a moment that you get sick. It doesn't matter with what. A common cold, a headache, an upset stomach. What do? Most likely, you'll take a pill. Maybe make an appointment with a doctor who will diagnose you and write a prescription. We live in a world where medicine is a science. It's precise, complex, but at its core, logical. We trust doctors because we know that their actions are backed by years of research, clinical trials, and accumulated knowledge. But now, let's ask a question that might seem strange. What is more frightening, the disease itself or the prescribed treatment? For us, people of the 21st century, the answer is obvious. But if we could transport ourselves back 100, 200, or especially 1,000 years, this question would take on entirely new, sinister colors. In those times, when a doctor entered a patient's room, his visit brought not relief, but fear, because the treatment he offered was often more torturous, more dangerous, and more lethal than the disease itself. This is a story of a time when medicine was not a salvation, but an ordeal. A story of the most insane, gruesome, and unimaginable methods of healing that humanity has ever devised. This is a journey into a world where doctors were more dangerous than executioners, where medicines were made of poisons and parts of human bodies, and where the best remedy for a headache was drilling a hole in the skull. Fasten your seatbelts, because we are heading into the past, into an era of terrifying medicine, where the line between healing and torture was so thin, it practically didn't exist. But before we dive into this frightening world of leeches, red-hot irons and mad surgeries, let's try to understand why. Why did people for millennia resort to such strange and at times, frankly, sadistic methods? Were they less intelligent than us? Did they enjoy suffering? The answer, of course, is no. They had their own logic. It was just completely different. It was built not on knowledge of anatomy, microbiology, or chemistry, but on faith, fear, and a very primitive understanding of the human body and the world at large. Try to put yourself in the shoes of an ordinary person from the past. The world around you is full of dangers. Drought destroys the harvest, wild animals roam the forests, enemy tribes conduct raids. And then there are diseases, invisible, insidious enemies that come from nowhere. Today you are healthy, and tomorrow you are burning with fever. Your child starts to cough, and a week later, he is gone. An epidemic of plague or smallpox wipes out half of your village. How do you explain this? Where does this scourge come from? In a world without microscopes to see bacteria, without X-rays to look inside the body, the only explanation is supernatural. Sickness is the punishment of the gods for sins. It is an evil spirit that has possessed the body. It is a curse cast by an unkind neighbor, a sorcerer. And if the cause of the disease is mystical, then the treatment must be appropriate. This gives rise to the first, most ancient logic of healing. If there is something bad inside a person, an evil spirit, an unclean force, then it must be expelled. How? By scaring it with loud cries, songs, and dances by the fire. By appeasing it with a sacrifice, giving the gods something valuable in exchange for health. By using amulets and charms that will drive away evil with their power. And if nothing helps, one can resort to a more radical method. If an evil spirit has settled in the head and is causing unbearable pain, then it must be given a way out. Drill a small hole in the skull so it can fly out. Sounds barbaric, but this is exactly how our ancestors reasoned in the Stone Age, and it was one of the first surgical operations in human history. The second logic, which appeared a little later but lasted for millennia, was more down to earth, but no less dangerous. It was based on a simple observation. If it hurts, it means there's something extra inside. Imagine you pricked your finger. It swells, turns red, becomes hot, and then pus comes out, and the pain subsides. What conclusion would a person who knows nothing about leukocytes and bacteria draw? The conclusion is simple. Something bad had accumulated in the finger, and when it came out, relief followed. Now let's scale this logic to the entire organism. If a person has a fever, a high temperature, if their whole body is burning, it means too much hot blood has accumulated in them. What needs to be done? Release the excess blood to restore balance. Thus was born the most popular, the longest lasting, and possibly the deadliest medical procedure in history, bloodletting. For 2,000 years, all of medicine, from ancient Greece to the end of the 19th century, was built on this seemingly simple idea. For thousands of years, doctors with a wise look would let their patients' blood, sincerely believing they were saving their lives, while in reality, they were only hastening their demise. So, step by step, from mysticism to primitive natural philosophy, the concepts of disease and treatment evolved. People sought answers using the tools they had: observation, superstitions, religious dogmas, and the method of trial and error. Most often, fatal errors. They saw that some plants could relieve pain or cause sleep and declared them magical. They found strange stones in the earth and believed in their healing power. They tried to heal with things that seemed strong and powerful to them: the venom of snakes, parts of predatory animals, minerals that shone like the sun. It was a long, painful, and bloody path. A path where every new discovery claimed thousands of lives before people understood its destructiveness. And to truly appreciate the giant leap that modern medicine has made, we need to walk this path from the very beginning, from the times when the first doctor was not a person in a white coat, but a shaman with a drum, a painted face, and a crazed look in his eyes, promising to cast the demons out of your body. Let's transport ourselves to deep antiquity, to the times before writing, cities, and civilizations. Imagine a small tribe of hunters and gatherers living in a cave or a primitive hut. Their life is a constant struggle for survival. Every day they are threatened by hunger, cold, and wild beasts. But there is an enemy even more terrifying and incomprehensible: disease. A sudden pain in the stomach, a fever that drives you mad, or a wound that, instead of healing, begins to fester and turn black. Who can help in such a situation? Who can you turn to for salvation? In this world, there are no doctors, no pharmacies, no hospitals. But there is one person who is believed to be able to speak with spirits, travel to other worlds, and command the forces of nature. This is the shaman, or sorcerer, the first doctor in human history. His methods of treatment have nothing in common with what we call medicine. His arsenal is not a scalpel and a stethoscope, but a drum, rattles, ritual masks, and bundles of dried herbs. When someone in the tribe falls ill, they are brought to the shaman. He builds a fire, begins his ritual. He enters a trance, monotonously beating the drum, chanting spells in an ancient language understood only by him and the spirits. His body writhes in a wild dance. His eyes roll back. He doesn't make a diagnosis. He communicates with the spirit world to find out the cause of the ailment. Perhaps the sick person has broken some taboo, angered the spirit of the forest or the river. Or maybe an evil demon, sent by a hostile sorcerer from a neighboring tribe, has entered his body. The treatment is aimed not at the body, but at the soul and the invisible entities believed to have caused the disease. The shaman might circle the patient for hours, fumigating him with smoke from sacred plants to drive out the evil spirit. He might summon spirit helpers in the form of animals to fight the demon of sickness. In some cases, a sacrifice is required. To appease an angry deity, the tribe might sacrifice an animal, and in the most extreme cases, even a human. All this is accompanied by loud cries, songs, and collective dances, the purpose of which is to frighten and expel the evil force. From our point of view, this looks like wild superstition. But for primitive man, it was the only hope. Of course, shamans also used more tangible remedies. Over thousands of years of trial and error, people learned about the properties of certain plants. They saw how animals ate specific herbs when they were sick and tried to do the same. This is how the first medicines appeared in the arsenal of ancient healers. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the basis of aspirin, was used to reduce fever and pain. Senna leaves were used as a laxative. Poppy heads were a powerful sedative and painkiller. But even these plants were perceived not as chemical compounds, but as carriers of magical power. It was believed that they needed to be collected at a specific time, for example, during a full moon, accompanied by special spells. The effectiveness of the herb depended not so much on its properties as on the correctness of the ritual performed. Along with plants, so-called magic stones, minerals of unusual shape or color, were also used. A beautiful quartz crystal or a piece of jade could be worn as an amulet for protection against diseases or applied to a sore spot, in the belief that the stone would absorb the illness. But the most shocking and, at the same time, amazing method of treatment in the Stone Age was trepanation of the skull. Archaeologists all over the world find ancient skulls with neatly made round or square holes in them. And the most astonishing thing is that the edges of these holes often show signs of healing. This means that the patients not only survived this terrible operation, but also lived for many years after it. Why? Just why did primitive people drill holes in each other's heads? They had no anesthesia, no antiseptics, no proper surgical instruments. The operation must have been unbearably painful, and the risk of death from shock, blood loss, or infection was colossal. The answer again lies in mystical thinking. It was believed that severe headaches, epileptic seizures, and mental confusion were all signs that an evil spirit was trapped in a person's head. And to release it, a hole had to be made in the bone. It was a kind of valve to release the pressure of evil energy. The operation was most likely performed by the same shaman using sharp flint scrape. The person was held down firmly, perhaps given some intoxicating concoction to drink, and the surgeon, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, scraped away the bone until he reached the dura mater. Judging by the number of healed trepanations, this method was considered quite successful. Perhaps in some cases, it really did bring relief. For example, if a headache was caused by an intracranial hemorrhage after an injury, removing a piece of the skull could reduce the pressure on the brain. But in most cases, the success of the treatment was probably due to the placebo effect, or the fact that the patient simply survived against all odds. The very fact that a person had undergone such an operation and remained alive was considered proof that the evil spirit had been expelled, and the shaman was all-powerful. With the emergence of the first civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt, medicine took a timid step from pure magic towards a semblance of science. Writing appeared, and doctors began to record their observations. Ancient Sumerian clay tablets and Egyptian papyrus, such as the famous Ebers Papyrus, which can be called the first medical encyclopedia, have survived to this day. In these texts, we see an amazing interweaving of mystical beliefs and quite rational advice. Egyptian doctors already had a certain specialization. There were separate healers for the eyes, for the teeth, for the stomach. They knew how to set dislocations, apply splints to fractures, and even performed simple surgical operations. They described hundreds of diseases and offered thousands of recipes for them. But alongside perfectly reasonable recommendations, like applying honey, which has antiseptic properties, to a wound, we find completely wild recipes. For example, to treat night blindness, it was advised to use juice from a bull's liver, which, by the way, makes sense, as the liver is rich in vitamin A. But for other eye diseases, it was proposed to drop the urine of a woman who had given birth to a boy, or even crocodile excrement, into the eyes. It was believed that the disease could be tricked or scared away by something disgusting. The cause of disease was still seen as supernatural. Any ailment, from a runny nose to leprosy, was attributed to the wrath of the gods, the machinations of demons, or the actions of evil spirits of the dead. Therefore, prayers and spells remained the main method of treatment. Every recipe in the Eber's papyrus is accompanied by a magic formula that the doctor had to pronounce for the medicine to work. The doctor was also a priest. He examined the patient, but the final diagnosis was made based on divination, for example, by the liver of a sacrificial animal. If the liver was bad, it meant the gods were not merciful, and there was little chance of recovery. Thus, even in the great civilizations of antiquity, medicine remained captive to mysticism. But soon, demons and spirits were replaced by a new, much more scientific-looking, and therefore even more dangerous theory, which for 2 millennia would define the path of Western medicine. A theory that turned blood from a symbol of life into the source of all ills. The era of shamanic rituals and Egyptian spells gave way to the age of classical philosophy, which gave the world great thinkers who sought to explain the world through logic and observation rather than myths. And medicine was no exception. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th century BC, is rightfully considered the father of modern medicine. It was he who first declared that diseases have natural, not supernatural causes. He taught physicians to carefully observe symptoms, take a patient's history, and keep records. The famous Hippocratic Oath is still a moral code for doctors around the world. It would seem that this was the dawn of real, scientific medicine. But it was within the depths of this ancient thought that a concept was born that would become the greatest misconception in the history of medicine, likely claiming more lives than all wars and epidemics combined. This was the theory of humoral pathology, or the doctrine of the 4 bodily fluids. This theory, later developed and canonized by the Roman physician Galen, was in its own way coherent and logical. It stated that the human body is composed of 4 primary fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these fluids corresponded to one of the 4 elements: air, water, fire, earth, one of the 4 seasons, and one of the 4 human temperaments. Blood was associated with air, spring, and the sanguine temperament, cheerful. Phlegm with water, winter, and the phlegmatic temperament, calm. Yellow bile with fire, summer, and the choleric temperament, irascible. And black bile with earth, autumn, and the melancholic temperament, sad. As long as all 4 fluids are in balance, in harmony, in the body, the person is healthy. But as soon as the balance is disturbed, disease arises. If an excess of any fluid accumulates in the body, this is the cause of the ailment. For example, it was believed that colds and coughs were caused by an excess of cold and moist phlegm, and fever, heat, redness of the skin. These were clear signs of an excess of hot and moist blood. This theory was incredibly convenient. It explained everything. Any disease, any symptom could be fitted into the framework of a fluid imbalance. And most importantly, it offered a simple and universal method of treatment. If a disease is caused by an excess of some fluid, then this excess fluid simply needs to be removed from the body. If you have an excess of phlegm, you will be given emetics and laxatives to cleanse the body. If bile predominates, you will be prescribed a diet and herbs that will calm it. But most often, for almost any illness, from a headache to the plague, doctors concluded that the patient had an excess of blood. Why blood specifically? Because its symptoms, heat, redness, pulsation, were the most obvious. Blood was considered the most important, the strongest fluid, and its excess the most common cause of all troubles. And so, for a full 2,000 years, the main and practically the only method of treatment in a doctor's arsenal became bloodletting. This procedure became a true panacea. Whatever happened to you, whether you broke your leg, caught pneumonia, suffered from depression, or simply fainted, the first thing a doctor would do was take out his instrument and let your blood. The logic was ironclad. It was necessary to remove the bad, stagnant, inflamed blood, so that new, healthy blood could form in its place. The procedure became as routine and commonplace as taking an aspirin is for us today. It was done not only for illnesses, but also for prevention, for example, every spring, to renew the body after winter. Bloodletting became part of daily life. It was practiced not only by licensed physicians, but also by barbers, bathhouse attendants, and even monks. The sign for a barbershop where you could not only get a haircut, but also have your blood let, was the famous striped pole. The red stripe on it symbolized blood, the white stripe symbolized bandages, and the pole itself represented the staff that the patient squeezed in his hand to make the veins in his arm bulge and easier to find. The methods of bloodletting were varied. The most common was phlebotomy or venesection. The doctor or barber would make an incision in a vein, usually in the crook of the elbow, and drain the blood into a special basin with markings to measure the volume precisely. The instrument used was a lancet, a small, double-edged knife. Over time, more ingenious devices appeared, such as the scarificator. This was a box with several blades that were activated by a spring mechanism. The device was placed on the skin, a lever was pressed, and the blade simultaneously made several shallow incisions. It was thought to be less painful than one deep cut with a lancet. After the incisions, a special heated cup was placed over the area, which, as it cooled, created a vacuum and drew blood from the wounds. Another popular method was arteriotomy, the opening of an artery, usually at the temple. This was a more dangerous procedure, as stopping arterial bleeding was more difficult. And of course, we must not forget about leeches, which were a kind of living syringe for localized bloodletting. We will talk more about them a little later. The amount of bloodlet could be enormous. In one session, they could drain a pint, or even two, about half a liter to a liter. And if the illness was serious, the procedure was repeated several times a day after day. The patient grew weak, pale, lost consciousness. But doctors saw this as a good sign. They believed it was a crisis after which healing would come. They called fainting from blood loss syncope and considered it a sign that the procedure had achieved its goal. The body had been cleansed of excess blood. In reality, they were simply driving the person into a state of hemorrhagic shock, depriving them of the strength needed to fight the disease. But the authority of Galen and the theory of the four humors were so unshakable that no one dared to doubt the correctness of this method. It lasted for almost 2 millennia, surviving the fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and even the Age of Enlightenment. Everyone was treated with bloodletting, from commoners to kings and presidents. And often, it was this treatment that became the cause of their death. One of the most classic examples is the death of the first president of the United States, George Washington. In December 1799, after spending several hours in the cold, he felt unwell. His throat became sore, his temperature rose, and it became difficult to breathe. Today, we would suggest it was acute epiglottitis or laryngitis, inflammation of the epiglottis or larynx. But the doctors of that time made a diagnosis based on humoral theory. The president has inflammation, therefore an excess of blood. The best doctors were summoned to him. In less than 24 hours, his blood was let 4 times. First, his estate manager did it, then 3 different doctors. In total, over several hours, about 3.5 liters of blood were taken from the elderly man, which is more than half of the total volume in his body. He was also given enemas, emetics, hot poultices of bran and vinegar were applied to his throat, and he was even made to inhale the vapors of vinegar and water, which only worsened the swelling of his larynx. With each hour, Washington's condition worsened. He grew weaker. He gasped for air. But the doctors, seeing that the treatment was not helping, only redoubled their efforts, letting blood again and again. In the end, exsanguinated and exhausted, George Washington died. His doctors were convinced they had done everything possible, but the disease proved stronger. In reality, they had killed their patient with their own hands. curing him to death. And there were thousands of such cases. King Charles II of England suffered a stroke in 1685. The court physicians immediately set to work. First, they let his blood from his arm, draining nearly half a liter. Then, the same amount from his neck. They applied cupping glasses, performed cauterization with a red-hot iron all over his body. They shaved his head and applied blistering plasters to it to cause sores. They forced him to drink emetics and laxatives. They blew powder of hellebore into his nose to induce sneezing. The doctors tried every method they knew to drive out the disease from the king's body. In a few days of torture, they turned the monarch into a mangled body, and he died in terrible agony. Yet, if they had simply left him alone, he might have had a chance to survive. Even the great Mozart, according to one version, fell victim to this barbaric treatment. When he fell ill in 1791, he was treated for acute miliary fever, and the main method, of course, was bloodletting. This only weakened him and possibly contributed to the kidney failure that caused his death. So why did this insane practice last so long? Why did no one notice for 2,000 years that bloodletting more often kills than cures? First, there was the authority of the ancients. Hippocrates and Galen were undisputed geniuses, and to doubt their teachings was tantamount to heresy. Their works were copied from century to century, and it never occurred to anyone to test them in practice. Second, doctors simply had no other theory that could explain disease. The humoral concept was all-encompassing and gave a simple explanation for complex things. To abandon it meant to admit one's complete ignorance, and no self-respecting physician could do that. Third, the human body is a surprisingly resilient system. Many people survived not because of, but in spite of bloodletting, and every such recovery was credited to the effectiveness of the method. And if the patient died, it was not the procedure that was to blame, but a disease so severe that even such a powerful remedy could not cope with it. Finally, bloodletting produced a visible, tangible result. The doctor didn't just give a pill, he performed an action. Blood flows, the patient weakens. The fever subsides. In reality, blood pressure was dropping. All this created the illusion of an active fight against the disease. For both the patient and the doctor, it was psychologically important to feel that something was being done. This illusion of control over the disease was so strong that it persisted until the end of the 19th century, until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch discovered the world of microbes and laid the foundations of modern scientific medicine. But until that moment, doctors had another faithful assistant in the business of exsanguinating patients, a living and much more precise instrument, the medicinal leech. If bloodletting with a lancet was brute force, then the use of leeches could be called an art. For the doctors of the past, these small, slippery creatures were something like high-precision weapons, ideal surgeons capable of performing miracles. Unlike the barber's knife, which left scars and could cause severe bleeding, the leech worked delicately, painlessly, and with surgical precision. The belief in the healing power of leeches was no less than in the power of bloodletting in general, and in some eras, it grew into a real madness, which came to be known as leech vampirism. The medicinal leech, or Hirudo medicinalis, is truly a unique creation of nature. Its saliva contains a whole cocktail of biologically active substances. The most famous of these is hirudin, a powerful anticoagulant that prevents blood from clotting. It is thanks to hirudin that blood from the wound left by a leech can ooze for several hours after the leech itself is satiated and has fallen off. In addition, leech saliva has an anesthetic effect, so its bite is practically painless, as well as a vasodilating and anti-inflammatory action. Ancient doctors, of course, knew nothing about hirudin, but they saw the result. They saw that after a leech bite, swelling subsided, and pain and inflammation decreased. This was enough to make the leech one of the main tools in medical practice for many centuries. Leeches were used in ancient Egypt and India, but their real triumph came in the Middle Ages and the modern era. They were used to treat almost everything. Toothache? Place a leech on the gum. Headache? Apply a few to the temples. Inflamed eyes? There were tiny leeches for that, which were placed directly on the eyeball. They were used to treat hemorrhoids, gout, epilepsy, mental disorders, and even nymphomania. It was believed that leeches could suck out not only bad blood, but the disease itself. They were applied to tumors, bruises, and inflamed joints. Doctors developed entire charts showing which points on the body and in what quantity leeches should be applied for different diseases. It was a whole art, requiring knowledge and experience. The demand for leeches was enormous. This created a whole industry for their collection and sale. This was done by special people, often the poor, who wandered through swamps and ponds where leeches lived. The method of catching them was simple and gruesome. The catcher would wade into the water up to his knees and just wait for the leeches to attach themselves to his legs. Then he would collect them and put them in a special bag. It was dangerous work. From the constant loss of blood, the catchers developed anemia, and the sores on their legs often became inflamed and festered. But the business was profitable. The caught leeches were sold to apothecaries, who kept them in large glass jars, displaying them in the window as a sign of their establishment's quality. Doctors bought them by the dozens and hundreds. The peak of leech mania was the 19th century, especially in France. The French physician François-Joseph Victor Broussais was a staunch supporter of the theory that all diseases were caused by inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract, and the best remedy for inflammation was bloodletting, specifically with leeches. His teaching became incredibly popular. In the 1830s, France imported more than 40 million leeches a year. There weren't enough of them. Their price skyrocketed. A real leech frenzy began. Patients were simultaneously treated with 50, 80, or even 100 leeches. People were treated until they lost consciousness from blood loss. Doctors went bankrupt because all their money was spent on purchasing scarce leeches. The swamps and ponds of Europe were depleted. Leeches had to be imported from Russia, Turkey, and even Australia. This period went down in history as the Great Leech Craze. How many people died from such treatment is impossible to calculate. The irony is that Dr. Broussais himself, when he felt ill, prescribed his favorite remedy for himself. A huge number of leeches were applied to him, and a few days later, he died, a victim of his own method. With the development of scientific medicine in the second half of the 19th century, the popularity of leeches sharply declined. Doctors finally understood that exsanguinating a patient was not the best way to fight disease. Leeches became a symbol of backward, barbaric medicine of the past. But, unlike bloodletting with a lancet, which has been consigned to oblivion forever, the story of leeches did not end there. At the end of the 20th century, they unexpectedly returned to medical practice, but in a completely new capacity. Modern surgeons, especially in microsurgery and plastic surgery, have rediscovered the unique properties of leech saliva. When doctors reattach a severed finger, ear, or flap of skin, the biggest problem is restoring not only arterial, but also venous blood flow. Arteries are easier to suture, but thin veins are much more difficult. As a result, blood flows to the reattached part, but the outflow is difficult. Venous congestion and swelling occur, and the tissues can die. And this is where the leech comes to the rescue. It is placed on the reattached organ, and it does what no medicine can. It not only sucks out the stagnant blood, but also injects hirudin and other enzymes into the tissues, which relieve swelling, dilate blood vessels, and prevent thrombosis. The leech works like a perfect micropump, maintaining blood circulation in the tissues until the body's own veins are restored. So today, in the sterile operating rooms of the most modern clinics, you can see the same picture as 300 years ago. A small, unassuming creature, saving a person's health and sometimes their life. It is a surprising example of how an ancient, almost forgotten method has found its application in the medicine of the future, having traveled the path from a panacea to a high-tech tool. But if leeches were just one of the tools in a doctor's hands, there was a whole area of medicine where the doctor himself became an executioner, and his office a torture chamber. We are talking about surgery. Imagine a world without anesthesia, a world where there is no way to turn off pain. Every touch of a knife to living flesh is an explosion of agony, a scream that cannot be silenced, suffering that cannot be measured. This was the world in which surgeons worked for thousands of years. Until the mid-19th century, any operation was a monstrous ordeal for both the patient and the doctor. Surgery was not considered an elite part of medicine. On the contrary, it was a dirty, bloody craft, practiced mainly by barbers and former military medics. Self-respecting physicians, followers of Galen, disdained working with their hands and preferred to discourse on the balance of fluids, leaving the butchery to craftsmen. The surgeon of that time was not an intellectual in a white coat, but a strong, physically resilient man with steady nerves and a firm hand. His main quality was not precision, but speed. The faster he could saw off a leg or cut a stone out of the bladder, the better the patient's chances of survival, not from the operation itself, but from the shock of the pain. The operating room of that time had nothing in common with modern sterile theaters. It could be a basement, a barn, or a special amphitheater in a medical school, where students pushing and shoving watched the proceedings from the gallery. In the center stood a wooden table, soaked through with the blood and pus of previous patients. On the floor was a bucket of sawdust to absorb the blood. The patient, crazed with fear, was brought in and tied tightly to the table. But the straps were not enough. From all sides, he was held by several burly orderlies, whose job was simple: to prevent him from breaking free when the hell began. There was no anesthesia, but the patient might be given a glass of whiskey or an opium tincture, which, however, helped little. Sometimes he was simply hit on the head to make him lose consciousness, but this was a risky method. And then the surgeon appeared. He wore no gloves, no mask. On the contrary, his work coat, covered with old bloodstains, was a source of pride. It testified to his vast experience. His instruments, saws, knives, hooks, chisels, he might casually lay on a dirty windowsill or simply hold in his mouth to free his hands. Before starting the operation, he might demonstratively sharpen the blade of his knife on the sole of his boot. And then the show began. The most common operation was amputation. In an era without antibiotics, any open fracture or serious limb wound almost guaranteed gangrene, and the only way to save a life was amputation. The surgeon would take a large amputation knife and in one motion cut through the skin, muscles, and vessels down to the bone. Then an assistant would pull the skin and muscles up to expose the bone. After that, the saw came into play. The sound of the saw biting into living bone and the desperate, inhuman screams of the patient merged into a single, soul-chilling symphony. The whole procedure took an experienced surgeon a few minutes. The famous Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, nicknamed the fastest knife in the West End, could amputate a leg in 2.5 minutes. But even these minutes were an eternity of pure horror for the patient. Once, in his haste, Liston accidentally chopped off the fingers of his assistant, who was holding the patient's leg. Both the patient and the assistant later died of gangrene, and one of the observers, it is said, died of fright on the spot. This is the only operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. After the limb was sawn off, the next stage began, stopping the bleeding. The large vessels were tied with threads or simply cauterized with a red-hot iron. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with the smell of blood. Then a dressing soaked in tar or turpentine was applied to the stump, and the patient, if he was still alive, was carried to the ward. But his torments were not over. A new, even more insidious enemy awaited him: infection. No one suspected the existence of microbes. Surgeons washed neither their hands nor their instruments. With the same saw, they could cut off 10 legs in a day, only rinsing it in a bucket of murky water. Naturally, the survival rate after such operations was extremely low. Most patients died within a few days from sepsis, gangrene, or tetanus. Pus in a wound was not considered a sign of infection, but on the contrary, laudable pus. Pus laudabile, a good sign indicating that the body was fighting the disease. Operations on the battlefield were even more terrifying. A military surgeon, like the famous Ambroise Rey, who worked in the 16th century, or Dominique Jean Larrey, Napoleon's personal surgeon, had to operate right in the middle of a battle, amidst the whistle of bullets and the roar of cannons. Any relatively flat surface served as an operating table. The wounded were brought in by the hundreds. The surgeon worked without a break, up to his elbows in blood. Larry, it is said, could perform 200 amputations in a single day. He was known for inventing the flying ambulance, light carts that could quickly evacuate the wounded from the battlefield. But the methods of treatment remained the same. Bullets and shrapnel were extracted from wounds with special forceps. Bleeding was stopped by cauterization. Paré was one of the first to widely use the ligation of arteries instead of cauterization, which saved many lives. But even in his hands, surgery remained a bloody and desperate craft. The instruments of medieval and Renaissance surgeons today look like torture devices from an Inquisition museum. Huge saws for amputations, fearsome-looking knives of various shapes and sizes, tree fiends for drilling the skull that looked like a brace and bit, special forceps for extracting arrowheads, retractors for wounds, hooks for pulling tissues. All this was made of coarse iron, without any concern for the patient's comfort or sterility. There were also more specific instruments. For example, for the operation to remove stones from the bladder, lithotomy, a set was used that would make anyone shudder. Through an incision in the perineum, a metal guide was inserted into the bladder, along which forceps were then inserted. After feeling for the stone, the surgeon would grasp it and pull it out with force. This operation was incredibly painful and dangerous, often leading to incontinence, impotence, and fatal infections. But kidney and bladder stones were such a common and agonizing problem that people were willing to take any risk just to get rid of the pain. The accounts of eyewitnesses and the patients themselves, if they survived, paint a picture of unimaginable suffering. The English novelist Fanny Burney underwent a mastectomy in 1811 for breast cancer. The operation was performed by the aforementioned Dominique Jean Larrey. She left a detailed description of her experience. She wrote of being pinned to the bed by 7 men and 1 woman, of the glint of polished steel, of the knife cutting into her flesh, severing veins, arteries, nerves. I began a scream that lasted unintermittingly during the whole time of the incision. I am sure it must have been heard out of the house. She described the surgeon scraping her ribs, a sound even more horrible to her than the pain itself. Amazingly, Fanny Burney not only survived this operation, but lived for almost 30 more years. But her case was the exception rather than the rule. Most patients who went under the surgeon's knife were signing their own death warrant. Surgery before the age of anesthesia was a last resort, a desperate measure taken when death from the disease was almost inevitable. But even if the surgeon's scalpel could not reach the disease, doctors had another, no less formidable weapon in their arsenal, capable of leaving its mark on the body and soul of the patient forever. This was fire and red-hot iron. In a world without antibiotics, where any wound could be fatal, doctors sought ways to stop the spread of contagion. And one of the oldest, most intuitive, and at the same time most brutal methods was cauterization. The logic of this method was simple and brutal. If there is something bad in a wound, poison, rot, then it must simply be burned out. Fire has always been considered a purifying force, capable of destroying any filth. And doctors transferred this belief into their practice, turning the red-hot iron into one of the main surgical instruments. Cauterization was used for a variety of purposes. First and foremost, to stop bleeding after amputations or large wounds. As we have already mentioned, before Ambroise Paré popularized the ligation of arteries, cauterization was the primary method of hemostasis. Imagine the scene. After a leg has been amputated, an assistant brings a cauterizing iron, a metal tool on a long handle with a working end of various shapes. A ball, a blade, a disc, heated red-hot from a brazier. The surgeon would take this instrument and press it against the bleeding surface of the stump. There was a hiss, smoke rose, and the disgusting smell of burnt flesh filled the air. The blood coagulated. The vessels were sealed. It was incredibly painful, but often it was the only way to save the patient from bleeding to death. In addition, cauterization was used to cleanse infected wounds. It was believed that the venom from a snake bite or a rabid dog could only be neutralized by burning it out of the wound. The same applied to gangrene. Doctors would burn away the blackened, dead tissue in the hope of stopping the spread of the disease. Cauterization was a standard procedure for treating tumors, ulcers, hemorrhoids, and even toothaches, where the red-hot instrument was applied to the aching tooth. In medieval Arab treatises, for example, by the famous physician Abul al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, more than 50 types of operations involving cauterization are described. He used it to remove cataracts, treat fistulas, and even for cosmetic procedures, such as straightening teeth. Besides red-hot iron, other caustic substances were used. Boiling oil was very popular. For example, for a long time, it was believed that gunshot wounds were poisoned by gunpowder and needed to be treated with boiling oil. This hellish mixture was poured into the wounds of injured soldiers, causing them unbearable suffering. The same Ambroise Paré, once when he ran out of oil during a battle, was forced to treat wounds with a milder mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To his surprise, the next morning, the soldiers he had treated with this new method felt much better and suffered less pain than those whose wounds had been doused with boiling oil. This incident made him doubt the benefits of cauterization and was one of the impetuses for the development of more humane surgery. Fire therapy was common not only in surgery. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, fire was also used to treat internal diseases. For example, for gout or arthritis, red-hot objects were applied to the sore joints to drive out the pain. It was believed that the heat of the fire could melt and remove the cold and moist humors, causing the disease from the body. This idea was part of the same humoral theory, treat like with opposite. Cold diseases were treated with heat, hot diseases with cold. Along with fire and iron, other aggressive substances were used for cauterization. Concentrated acids, such as nitric acid, caustic alkalis, sulfur, tar. All of this was applied to the skin or wounds, causing a chemical burn that was supposed to cleanse and heal. The consequences of such treatment were terrible. It left behind disfiguring scars, often led to even greater infection and tissue necrosis. A person who went through such healing by fire remained a cripple for life, if they survived at all. But in a world without antiseptics and antibiotics, this seemed to be the only way to fight an invisible threat. The doctors of the past were willing to go to any extreme to defeat disease, and their quests sometimes led them into the darkest and most dangerous realms of knowledge, on the border between medicine, magic, and madness. Such a realm was alchemy. In the mind of a modern person, an alchemist is a half-mad old man in a pointed hat, who in his laboratory filled with flasks is trying to turn lead into gold. This is partly true, but the goals of alchemy were much broader. Alchemists sought not only the philosopher's stone to obtain gold, but also a universal elixir, a panacea, a cure for all diseases that grants eternal youth and immortality. Therefore, alchemy and medicine were inextricably linked for many centuries. Physician alchemists, or iatrochemists, believed that the human body was a kind of microcosm in which the same processes occurred as in the larger world, the macrocosm. And if in nature it is possible to transform some substances into others, then the same can be done in the human body, transforming disease into health. One of the key figures in this field was Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist of the 16th century. He fiercely criticized the ancient humoral theory of Galen and argued that chemical processes were the basis of life and disease. He introduced into medicine the three primary principles of alchemy: mercury, sulfur, and salt. In his opinion, health was the harmony of these three principles in the body, and disease was their imbalance. And diseases should be treated not with bloodletting, but with chemical preparations, minerals, and metals. Paracelsus formulated one of the most important principles of pharmacology. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. He was right. But in his time, it was almost impossible to determine the correct dose, and treatment often turned into poisoning. The most striking example of alchemical medicine was the use of mercury. This liquid metal, mesmerizing in its appearance, had always attracted alchemists. They considered it one of the primary elements. And when at the end of the 15th century, a new terrible disease swept through Europe, syphilis, which was called the Great Pox, or the French disease, doctors turned to mercury in search of a cure. Syphilis was horrific. It began with sores. Then a rash appeared all over the body, fever, bone pain, and in the later stages, it affected the internal organs and nervous system, leading to madness and death. And then someone noticed that mercury ointments, which were used to treat skin parasites like scabies, seemed to help with syphilitic sores as well. Thus was born one of the most agonizing and dangerous treatments in history. A saying emerged: one night with Venus, a lifetime with mercury. Patients with syphilis were treated with mercury in a variety of ways. The most common was rubbing mercury ointment into the skin. The patient was locked in a hot, stuffy room, and for several or even months, a huge amount of ointment containing pure mercury was rubbed into their skin. Another method was mercury inhalation. The patient was seated in a special box, under which cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was heated on a brazier. The patient was forced to inhale the poisonous fumes. Mercury was also taken orally in the form of pills. The treatment was considered successful if the patient began to salivate profusely. Doctors believed that along with the saliva, the poison of syphilis was leaving the body. In reality, this was just a classic symptom of acute mercury poisoning. Patients' teeth fell out, their gums turned black and bled, their jawbones disintegrated. They were tormented by tremors, kidney failure, neurological disorders, and severe mental disturbances. Many died not from syphilis, but from the treatment itself. But since there was no alternative, this barbaric method persisted for almost 400 years, until the discovery of penicillin in the 20th century. In addition to mercury, physician alchemists tried to use other metals. Antimony was very popular. It was used as a powerful emetic and laxative. It was believed to perfectly cleanse the body. Patients were given wine infused in antimony cups or pills with its salts. Mozart, some researchers believe, may have been poisoned by antimony prescribed by his doctors. Arsenic, another deadly poison, was also used in small doses as a tonic, especially in the 19th century. It was thought to improve complexion and give strength. Gold and silver, as noble metals, were also considered medicinal. They were taken internally in the form of powders or solutions. It was believed that gold could strengthen the heart and prolong life. Chinese emperors for centuries sought an elixir of immortality, and often it included gold, jade, and that same mercury. Emperor Qin Shi, the first emperor of a unified China, is believed to have died from mercury poisoning, which he took in huge quantities, believing it would grant him eternal life. The search for a panacea gave rise to a huge number of charlatan elixirs that were sold at fairs and in pharmacies. Their composition was a secret, but they often contained the most dangerous substances: mercury, antimony, arsenic, lead, mixed with herbs and alcohol. People in desperation bought these potions, hoping for a miracle, but instead of a cure, they got only poisoning and death. Alchemical medicine, which began as an attempt to find a new, deeper approach to treatment, in practice often turned into legalized poisoning. It showed that even the best intentions, not supported by scientific knowledge, can lead to catastrophic consequences. Doctors sincerely believed that by prescribing a poison to a patient in therapeutic doses, they were saving him. This dangerous self-deception continued into later eras, when mercury and arsenic were replaced by new, even more seductive and deadly drugs. With the dawn of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, medicine seemed to take a huge leap forward. Progress in chemistry allowed scientists to isolate pure active substances from plants. This was a true revolution. Instead of chewing willow bark, one could take an aspirin tablet. Instead of drinking a tincture of opium poppy, one could get a precise dose of pure morphine. Doctors were ecstatic. They now had powerful, fast-acting drugs at their disposal. But the euphoria of these new possibilities was so great that they completely overlooked the dark side of these miracle drugs. The era that seemed to be the dawn of modern pharmacology actually turned into an era of legal drug addiction and mass poisonings. One of the main heroes of this era was opium and its derivatives, morphine and heroin. Opium, the milky sap of the opium poppy, had been known since antiquity as a powerful painkiller and sedative. But in the 19th century, it became a truly universal medicine. It was sold in pharmacies without a prescription as a tincture in alcohol called laudanum. Laudanum was used to treat everything: coughs, diarrhea, toothaches, insomnia, depression, menstrual pain. It was given to infants to stop them from crying and help them sleep better. Many Victorian housewives, suffering from boredom and nerves, regularly took laudanum, essentially becoming addicts. When morphine was isolated from opium in 1804, doctors thought they had found the perfect painkiller, free from the drawbacks of opium, particularly its addictive properties. How wrong they were. Morphine turned out to be even more potent and even more addictive. It began to be administered using the newly invented syringe, which only intensified its effect and accelerated addiction. Thousands of soldiers wounded during the American Civil War returned home with a soldier's disease, morphine addiction. But the pinnacle of this madness was the advent of heroin. In 1898, the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, the same one that gave the world aspirin, launched a new cough medicine. It was synthesized from morphine and was, according to the manufacturers, several times more effective and, most importantly, completely safe and non-addictive. This medicine was given a heroic name: heroin. It was advertised as a remedy for coughs, bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis. It was prescribed to adults and children. Doctors enthusiastically declared that heroin even helped with morphine addiction. They were trying to treat one addiction with another, even more terrible one. It took more than a decade for the world to realize that Bayer had unleashed a real devil. Heroin turned out to be one of the most dangerous and rapidly addictive drugs in history. Another miracle plant of the 19th century was coca. For centuries, South American Indians had chewed coca leaves to combat fatigue and hunger. When European chemists isolated the pure alkaloid from it, cocaine, a new wave of euphoria began. Cocaine was declared a panacea for all ills. It was extolled by Sigmund Freud himself, who actively used it and prescribed it to his patients for depression, asthma, digestive disorders, and even morphine addiction. The same mistake again. He dedicated a laudatory article to cocaine on coca. Cocaine became incredibly fashionable. It was added to drops for toothaches, throat lozenges, and of course, tonic drinks. The most famous of these was Vin Mariani, a French wine infused with coca leaves. It was advertised as a drink that gave strength, energy, and good spirits. It was enjoyed by kings, popes, writers, and artists. In the United States, another drink was created in its image, which also initially contained an extract of coca leaves and cola nuts. This drink was called Coca-Cola, but the madness didn't end there. In the early 20th century, after the discovery of radioactivity, the world was gripped by radium fever. Radium, recently discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie, seemed to be a source of incredible, almost magical energy. And if it radiates energy, it means it can give it to the human body, healing it and prolonging life. Hundreds of radioactive products appeared. Radioactive face creams that promised eternal youth. Radioactive toothpaste, radioactive chocolate, radioactive underwear. But the most dangerous invention was radioactive water. Charlatans sold special devices for activating drinking water with radium. One of the most famous such products was Radithor, a distilled water containing dissolved salts of radium and thorium. It was advertised as a cure for arthritis, gout, impotence, and 100 other ailments. One of the avid fans of Radithor was the American industrialist and sportsman Eben Byers. He drank several bottles of this medicine a day. After a few years, he began to experience terrible pain. His teeth started falling out, and his jaw bones literally disintegrated. Radium had incorporated itself into his bone tissue and was slowly destroying him from within. When he died in 1932, there was so much radiation in his body that he had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. His horrific death sobered many and led to stricter controls on the sale of such medicines. The doctors of the past, blinded by faith in progress, did not see the obvious. They prescribed poisons and narcotics to their patients, sincerely believing that these were advanced scientific methods. Children's cough syrups and teething remedies, like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, contained huge amounts of morphine and alcohol. They did indeed soothe the children, often permanently. Diet pills contained thyroid extracts, causing thyrotoxicosis. Tonics contained arsenic and strychnine. Why was this considered progressive? Because for the first time in history, doctors had the ability to actively influence the body's chemistry. These substances produced a quick and noticeable effect. Pain disappeared, mood improved, coughing stopped. The long-term consequences, such as addiction, chronic poisoning, and death, were either not noticed or attributed to something else. It was a dangerous, but perhaps necessary stage in the development of pharmacology. Humanity had to learn from its own bitter experience that there is a very fine line between a medicine and a poison. But even these insane medicines might seem like innocent mischief compared to another, even darker and more gruesome chapter in the history of medicine: cannibalistic medicine. If the thought of being treated with poisons and narcotics disgusts you, then prepare for something truly shocking. For many centuries, during the height of European civilization, in the age of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, one of the most sought-after and expensive medicines in European pharmacies was human bodies. Yes, you heard that right. Doctors, scientists, priests, and even kings believed in the healing power of the flesh, blood, and bones of dead people. This practice, which we would today call medical cannibalism, was so widespread that it shocked no one. It was considered an advanced area of medicine. The most popular of these gruesome remedies was mumia. Today, we use this word for a mountain resin, but back then, Mumia meant a powder made from real ancient Egyptian mummies. It all started with a misunderstanding. In antiquity, natural bitumen or asphalt, which seeped from rocks in Persia, was used as a medicine. It was called mumia. It was believed to help with fractures and many other ailments. But over time, the supplies of natural bitumen ran out, and someone started a rumor that the black substance impregnating Egyptian mummies was the same thing. From that moment on, a real hunt for the ancient tombs of Egypt began. Thousands of mummies, pharaohs, priests, common people, were dug up, brought to Europe, ground into powder, and sold in pharmacies as a panacea for all diseases. Mummy powder was taken internally for headaches, epilepsy, stomach ulcers. It was sprinkled on wounds. The demand was so great that real Egyptian mummies became scarce. And so, enterprising dealers began to produce fakes. They dug up the bodies of the recently deceased poor, criminals, vagrants, dried them in the sun or in ovens, treated them with bitumen, and sold them as an ancient remedy. For centuries, Europeans ate their own countrymen, believing they were being treated with the powder of pharaohs. But mummies were only the beginning. It was believed that the body of a person who had died, not a natural, but a violent and sudden death, possessed special healing power. The logic was this: at the moment of death, the life force, or spirit, does not have time to leave the body and remains within it. Therefore, the body parts of young, healthy people, such as executed criminals or gladiators fallen in the arena, were particularly valued. In ancient Rome, it was common for people to run into the arena with cups to collect the fresh, still warm blood of a slain gladiator. It was believed that drinking it could cure epilepsy. This practice survived into the Middle Ages and the modern era. Executioners were not only the enforcers of sentences, but also a kind of healer. After an execution, they would sell the blood, fat, and body parts of the executed. Human fat was used to make ointments for rheumatism and arthritis. Powdered skull was considered the best remedy for migraines and dizziness. Moss that grew on skulls that had been hanging on the gallows for a long time was especially valued. It was called usnea, or skull moss, and was used to stop bleeding. This cannibalistic medicine was not just a folk superstition. It was approved and practiced by the most famous doctors of the time. The same Paracelsus actively recommended the use of blood and other parts of the human body in medicine. The English physician and philosopher Francis Bacon advised applying pieces of a living person's flesh to wounds for better healing. Even the most enlightened minds of the Renaissance saw nothing reprehensible in this. Why? The basis for this was ancient magical beliefs. First, the principle of sympathetic magic. Like cures like. If your head hurts, you should be treated with a skull. If you have blood problems, you should drink blood. Second, the belief in the transfer of life force. By eating a part of a strong, healthy person's body, it was believed that one could appropriate their strength and health. The Church, which one would think should have fought against such pagan and barbaric practices, turned a blind eye and sometimes even encouraged it. After all, in the Christian rite of communion, believers symbolically partake of the body and blood of Christ. This idea of sacred cannibalism made medical cannibalism more acceptable in the eyes of society. Moreover, the use of the bodies of executed criminals was seen as an additional punishment and humiliation for them, even after death. Their bodies were not committed to the earth, but were used for the needs of society. Thus, interweaving ancient magic, Christian symbolism, and pragmatism created a cultural environment in which eating one's own kind for health was considered the norm. This gruesome chapter in the history of medicine only ended in the Age of Enlightenment, when scientific thought finally displaced magical thinking. But even after that, doctors' arsenals still contained methods that, in their repulsiveness, could rival the eating of mummies. These methods were related to a complete lack of understanding of hygiene. We have already talked about terrible operations and the fact that most patients died from post-operative infections. But why did this happen? The answer is simple, and at the same time shocking. Until the end of the 19th century, doctors and scientists had no idea about the existence of microbes. They did not know that diseases could be caused by tiny, invisible organisms. The so-called miasma theory prevailed. It stated that diseases, especially epidemics like plague, cholera, or typhus, were caused by miasmas, poisonous vapors, bad air, that rose from decaying organic waste, swamps, and other filth. Based on this theory, the main way to fight diseases was to fight bad smells. If a disease is a stench, then it should be treated with another, stronger stench, or conversely, with pleasant aromas that could overpower the miasmas. Plague doctors in European cities wore the famous masks with a long beak. This beak was not for intimidation. It was stuffed with strong-smelling herbs, spices, and camphor. It was believed that this aromatic filter would protect the doctor from inhaling the deadly miasmas. People in cities burned bonfires on the streets to purify the air with smoke. They carried pomanders, special balls with aromatic substances, which they constantly sniffed when in public places. But sometimes the logic reached the point of absurdity. It was believed that if miasmas were a product of decay, then one should surround oneself with even stronger products of decomposition to fight fire with fire. People were advised to live near stockyards, to keep goats, known for their strong smell, in their homes, or even to inhale the fumes from public toilets. It was believed that these smells, although unpleasant, were familiar and could protect against the foreign and deadly miasmas of the plague. The legendary physician Nostradamus, during a plague epidemic, advised his patients to carry and constantly sniff balls made of excrement. The lack of understanding of infection led to absolutely monstrous practices. Doctors went from one patient to another without washing their hands. They could perform an autopsy and then, without washing their hands, go to deliver a baby. It was this observation that led the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis to a brilliant discovery in the mid-19th century. He noticed that in the part of the Vienna hospital where medical students who came straight from the dissection room delivered babies, the mortality rate from childbed fever was several times higher than in the part where midwives, who did not deal with corpses, worked. Semmelweis suggested that the students were transferring some cadaverous particles on their hands and ordered all staff to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime before examining women in labor. The mortality rate immediately dropped dramatically. It seemed that salvation had been found, but the medical community met Semmelweis's discovery with hostility. The idea that respected doctors, gentlemen, could be carriers of contagion and the murderers of their patients seemed insulting and absurd. Semmelweis was persecuted, lost his job, went mad, and died in a mental asylum from the very sepsis he had fought so successfully. Only years later, after the work of Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, was he proven right. But as long as the miasma theory ruled minds, treatment with filth and impurities flourished. Bathing in urine, mud, and manure was considered healing. Urine, especially one's own, was drunk and used as a facial lotion and mouthwash. It was believed to have cleansing properties. Cow dung was smeared on the body to treat skin diseases. Dog excrement mixed with honey was used to treat sore throats. These methods were based on the ancient belief that disgusting and unclean substances could ward off the evil spirits of disease. In a world without hygiene, where slops were thrown directly onto the streets, where people washed at best a few times a year, and where lice were considered pearls of God, such methods of treatment did not seem out of the ordinary. They were just a logical extension of the unsanitary conditions in which most people lived. And in this dirty and superstitious world, a particularly vulnerable category of patients was women. whose health and diseases were surrounded by so many myths and misconceptions for centuries that it is a separate, tragic story in itself. For most of history, medicine was a man's world. Male doctors tried to understand and treat the female body, of which they had a very vague and often completely fantastical understanding. The female body was considered an inferior, flawed version of the male's. Its main function was recognized as childbirth, and all its problems and diseases were explained through the prism of the reproductive system. One of the oldest and most persistent myths was the concept of the wandering womb. The ancient Greeks, including Hippocrates himself, believed that the uterus was not a fixed organ, but a kind of independent animal inside a woman. When a woman did not have sexual relations for a long time and did not give birth, the uterus, suffering from dryness, would begin to wander through the body in search of moisture. Rising upwards, it would press on other organs, the heart, lungs, diaphragm, causing suffocation, convulsions, fainting, and emotional instability. They called this condition hysteria, from the Greek hystera, uterus. The treatment was appropriate. It was necessary to lure the uterus back to its place. To do this, foul-smelling substances, like burnt wool, were brought to the woman's nose, and on the contrary, fragrant substances were brought to her loins. It was believed that the uterus, like a living creature, would flee from the bad smell downwards towards the good one. The most reliable way to calm the wandering womb was considered to be marriage and regular pregnancy. This idea, in various forms, persisted almost until the 20th century. In the Victorian era, a diagnosis of hysteria was given to almost any woman who showed too much emotion, was too educated, independent, or sexually unsatisfied. The symptoms of hysteria were considered to be insomnia, irritability, fainting, loss of appetite, anxiety, in short, almost anything. Doctors believed that the cause of this condition was an accumulation of fluid in the uterus, and for treatment, the woman needed a paroxysm, that is, an orgasm. Since it was improper for a doctor to engage in this directly with a patient, they induced a hysterical paroxysm through manual massage of the pelvic area. This procedure was long, tedious, and considered purely medical, devoid of any erotic subtext. Doctors complained that their hands got tired. And so, to make their work easier, at the end of the 19th century, an enterprising English doctor named Joseph Mortimer Granville invented a special electromechanical massage device that ran on a steam engine. It was the world's first vibrator. It became an incredibly popular medical instrument. Doctors used it in their offices to treat hysteria, and soon home models appeared, which were advertised in women's magazines as a remedy for nervousness and fatigue. Thus, the device that today is associated with sexual pleasure was born in the depths of Victorian medicine as a tool to combat a woman's disease. The birthing practices of the past are another separate, terrible chapter. For centuries, childbirth was exclusively a woman's affair. It was handled by midwives, who passed down their knowledge and experience from generation to generation. They used herbs, spells, and massage. But with the development of scientific medicine, male doctors began to intervene more and more actively in this process, often with catastrophic consequences. They came to births with dirty hands, straight from the anatomy theater, bringing infection and causing epidemics of childbed fever. They used metal forceps, often clumsily, causing terrible injuries to both mother and child. In some cases, when labor was particularly difficult and the baby could not pass through the mother's pelvis, a symphysiotomy was performed, an operation to saw through the pubic symphysis of the pelvic bones to widen the birth canal. This crippling procedure left the woman disabled for life. But all these physical sufferings could seem insignificant compared to what awaited people whose illness affected not the body, but the mind. If the treatment of physical ailments in the past was cruel and ignorant, The treatment of the mentally ill was simply monstrous. For most of history, people with mental disorders were considered not sick, but possessed by the devil, cursed, or simply sinners. They were not treated, but punished, exiled from society, locked in chains. The first asylums were not hospitals, but prisons, places where one could commit unwanted relatives or simply strange people who did not fit into society. The conditions in these institutions were appalling. Patients were kept in dark, damp, cold cells, often chained to the walls. They were barely fed, beaten and doused with icy water. There was no treatment as such. The main goal was pacification and punishment. It was believed that a madman could be brought to his senses through shock and pain. The most sadistic methods were used. Patients were placed in rotating chairs and spun at high speed until they vomited and lost consciousness. They were submerged in ice baths for hours. They were subjected to surprise falls into cold water through a trap door in the floor. They were starved and then given emetics and laxatives. All this was called therapy. One of the most infamous institutions was the Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known as Bedlam. On certain days, for a small fee, the public was allowed in to gaze at the insane, as if they were animals in a zoo. It was a popular form of entertainment. Visitors laughed, teased, and even poked the unfortunate people chained to the walls with sticks. In the 19th and 20th centuries, outright sadism was replaced by methods that seemed more scientific, but were in fact no less cruel. Hydrotherapy appeared, where patients were kept in baths for hours or wrapped in wet, cold sheets. Electroshock, or electroconvulsive therapy, began to be used. It was originally invented after observing that epileptics sometimes experienced an improvement in their mental state after a seizure. Doctors decided to induce seizures artificially, using an electric current passed through the patient's brain. The procedure was performed without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, so it often led to broken bones and dislocations due to severe muscle contractions. But the pinnacle of 20th century psychiatric barbarism was undoubtedly the lobotomy. In the 1930s, the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz suggested that if the nerve fibers connecting the frontal lobes of the brain to the rest of it were severed, severe mental disorders could be cured. The frontal lobes are responsible for planning, self-control, and emotions. The idea was to calm agitated and anxious patients by destroying these connections. For his discovery, Moniz even received the Nobel Prize. But the true apostle and popularizer of the lobotomy was the American physician Walter Freeman. He perfected the operation, turning it into a quick 10-minute procedure. He didn't need an operating room. He performed what was called a transorbital lobotomy. Through the eye socket just above the eyeball, he inserted an instrument similar to an ice pick into the brain and, with a few movements, destroyed the nerve fibers. Freeman traveled across America in his van, which he called the lobotomobile, and performed thousands of these operations, often right in the wards of mental hospitals. The consequences of a lobotomy were horrific. Yes, some patients did indeed become calmer and more docile, but at what cost? They turned into vegetables, emotionless, apathetic beings, devoid of will, initiative, and personality. They lost the ability for complex thought processes, for creativity, for empathy. They ceased to be themselves. One of Freeman's most famous victims was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Due to her emotional instability and rebellious behavior, her father decided on a lobotomy for his 23-year-old daughter. The operation was a failure. Rosemary was left with the mental capacity of a young child for the rest of her life and spent the remainder of her days in a private institution. In total, tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed worldwide until the 1950s, when the advent of the first antipsychotic drugs led to the abandonment of this crippling operation. The history of psychiatry is perhaps the darkest illustration of how fear of the incomprehensible and the desire to control the other can breed monstrous cruelty under the guise of medicine. So when did it all end? When did the doctors cease to be more dangerous than the disease? The turning point came in the second half of the 19th century. It was a period of great discoveries that changed medicine forever and laid the foundation for the healthcare system we know today. 3 discoveries were truly revolutionary: anesthesia, antisepsis, and germ theory. In 1846, the American dentist William Morton first publicly demonstrated the use of ether as an anesthetic during an operation. The surgeon removed a tumor from a patient's neck, and the patient did not make a sound. It was a miracle. For the first time in thousands of years, man was able to conquer surgical pain. Anesthesia opened a new era in surgery. Doctors could now work slowly, carefully, without fear that the patient would die from the shock of pain. Complex, hours-long operations on internal organs, which were previously unthinkable, became possible. Following anesthesia came antisepsis. Based on the work of Louis Pasteur, who proved that putrefaction and fermentation are caused by microorganisms, the English surgeon Joseph Lister suggested that post-operative infections were caused by them as well. He began to spray a solution of carbolic acid, phenol, in the operating room and apply it to wounds to kill the microbes. The results were astounding. The mortality rate in his wards dropped several times over. Lister's idea of fighting microbes with chemical substances, antisepsis, later developed into asepsis, the method of preventing microbes from entering a wound through the sterilization of instruments, gloves, gowns, and everything that comes into contact with the patient. Surgery transformed from a bloody craft into a precise science. And finally, the third great discovery was the definitive establishment of the germ theory of disease, thanks to the work of the same Pasteur and the German scientist Robert Koch. They proved that many diseases, such as anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera, are caused by specific types of bacteria. This discovery overturned all previous ideas about medicine. It became clear that the cause of diseases was not an imbalance of fluids or miasmas, but invisible enemies that could and should be fought. This gave impetus to the development of hygiene, epidemiology, vaccination, and ultimately to the creation of the main weapon against bacteria, antibiotics, the first of which, penicillin, was discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. So why did humanity believe in this insane medicine for so long? For millennia. Why were bloodletting, cauterization, and treatment with poisons and filth considered effective for so long? There are many reasons. There was a lack of scientific knowledge, the power of tradition, and the unquestionable authority of ancient physicians. There was also the psychological need to do something, to actively fight the disease, even if these actions were senseless or harmful. And of course, there was the placebo effect and the amazing ability of the human body to heal itself, which the doctors of the past mistakenly attributed to their methods. Today, looking back, we shudder with horror and disbelief, but we should not be too arrogant. Some methods of the past, as we have seen with leeches, have unexpectedly found their application in modern medicine. Phytotherapy, or herbal medicine, is also experiencing a renaissance, but now on a scientific basis, where pure active substances are isolated from plants and their mechanisms of action are studied. Some minerals and poisons in microdoses are used in modern pharmacology. Medicine does not stand still. And who knows, perhaps in 200 years, our descendants will look at our current methods of treatment with the same horror and disbelief. Perhaps they will consider chemotherapy with its terrible side effects to be a barbarity comparable to treatment with mercury. And our current surgeries will seem to them to be crude interventions compared to genetic engineering or nano-robots capable of repairing the body at a cellular level. The history of medicine teaches us one thing. The path to knowledge is long and arduous, and it is often paved with suffering and mistakes. But it is thanks to these mistakes, to this bloody and painful experience of past generations, that we today have what our ancestors were deprived of, a chance for a long and healthy life, where a visit to the doctor brings not fear, but hope. And that, perhaps, is one of the greatest achievements of human civilization.